The air in Containment Unit 734 tasted of recycled oxygen and nutrient paste, a flavor so familiar it was no flavor at all. It was the taste of equilibrium, of a life measured in sterile cycles and monitored biometrics. Elian, designated Omega 734, stood before the reflection panel, his form a pale silhouette against the soft, uniform luminescence of the walls. The person looking back was a construct of the collective, from the placid set of his features to the neutral gray of his uniform, designed to absorb light, to absorb impulse, to be a vessel of perfect, unblemished calm. His scent, meticulously suppressed by hormonal regulators embedded in his bloodstream, was a clean, clinical void, the smell of nothing. He was not a person. He was a state of being, an asset refined to its highest potential. The reflection's eyes, the color of a winter storm before the snow falls, held a flicker of something that did not belong, a malfunction, a quiet, persistent error in the code of his conditioning. He pressed a hand to the cool, unyielding surface of the panel. The pressure was a physical fact in a world of curated sensations. His heart, a steady, regulated drumbeat, registered a fractional increase in tempo. An anomaly. The system would note it, log it, perhaps adjust his atmospheric composition or nutrient supplement to correct the deviation. But the deviation was not in his blood or his breath. It was deeper, a seed of chaos planted in the sterile soil of his soul. He had watered it with stolen moments of silence, with the observation of light refracting through a water dispenser, with the phantom memory of a touch he had never experienced. Tonight that seed would break ground. The routine was the scaffolding upon which his existence was built. 21 AAO, nutrient cycle. 2130, sensory deprivation for REM optimization. 22 RAO, system-wide biopurge. It was during the purge that the unit's internal sensors would be momentarily recalibrated, creating a window, a gap in the all-seeing eye of the collective. 17 seconds. He had counted them for 487 cycles, a silent rebellion of mathematics against doctrine. He moved with the fluid economy of motion drilled into him since incubation. Each gesture was precise, silent. He detached the biometric monitor from his wrist, a small silver disc that tethered him to the system. The skin beneath was pale, untouched. He placed it on the edge of the hydration unit, where the internal temperature would mimic his own for the crucial few minutes he needed. A trick learned from observing a maintenance drone's heat signature during a diagnostic. He was an observer. That was his primary function, after all, to observe, to receive, to comply. He had simply turned his observation inward and then outward upon the walls of his cage. The low hum of the facility shifted pitch, the familiar drone of the biopurge commencing. A faint scent of ozone filled the air, the smell of erasure. 17 seconds. He moved to the waste reclamation vent, a small grated panel near the floor. His fingers, slender and practiced, worked the hidden latch he had fashioned from a stripped nutrient tube. It was not strength that opened it, but knowledge of its precise weakness, the point of least resistance. A click, barely audible over the hum. He was not strong. He was precise. The vent opened into a dark, narrow conduit choked with the metallic tang of dust and lubricants. It was the smell of the facility's hidden anatomy, its guts. It was the first truly organic scent he had encountered in his conscious life, and it was overwhelming, a foul, beautiful perfume of decay and function. He slid into the darkness, pulling the grate closed behind him. The world dissolved into claustrophobic pressure and the scrape of his uniform against metal. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. The words were a mantra, a prayer to a God he did not know. He was a body moving through darkness, propelled by a singular, illogical imperative. Elsewhere, The conduits were a labyrinth, a schematic he had memorized from a discarded technician's datapad, glimpsed for a mere 12 seconds. His mind, trained for immense data retention, had captured it whole. He navigated by the subtle shifts in temperature, the vibrations of machinery through the metal walls of the tunnel. He was a ghost in the machine, a whisper in its iron lungs. Time ceased to be measured in cycles and became a frantic, desperate pulse in his own veins. The air grew colder, damper. A new scent reached him, cutting through the oil and dust. It was sharp, wet, and alive. It was the smell of rain. He had seen rain in simulations, a sterile, educational display of meteorological phenomena. This was different. This was a physical presence, a wild, chaotic scent that promised a world beyond filtered air and temperature control. He crawled faster, the rough metal scraping his knees and hands. He did not register the pain. Pain was a data point, and he was offline. He was free. A faint, gray light appeared ahead, filtering through a heavy maintenance grate. He pushed against it. It was heavy, sealed with rust and neglect. For a moment, despair, a foreign and debilitating emotion, threatened to paralyze him. His conditioning screamed at him, "Compliance is survival, deviation is termination." He pushed the voice down, drowning it with the scent of the rain. He found a new strength, born not of training, but of desperation. He braced his back against the conduit and pushed with his legs. A groan of tortured metal, a sliver of night opened up. He pushed again and the grate gave way, tumbling into wet darkness with a clang that echoed like a death knell. He scrambled out, landing on a surface that was not smooth, not sterile. It was rough, uneven, and wet. Gravel. The rain was a physical assault, cold and sharp against his face, plastering his thin uniform to his skin. He tilted his head back, opening his mouth to taste it. It was clean, metallic, nothing like the purified water of the unit. Above, there was no luminescent ceiling, only an endless churning blackness, occasionally ripped open by a flash of brilliant white light, followed by a sound so deep and powerful it vibrated in his bones. Lightning, thunder, words from a database now made terrifyingly real. He was outside. The word was too small for the reality of it. The sheer scale of the space, the violence of the weather, the cacophony of sounds and smells, it was a sensory overload that threatened to shatter his carefully constructed psyche. The collective's walls rose behind him, a sheer, featureless cliff of black plasteel disappearing into the storm. There were no lights, no windows. It was designed to be impenetrable, a fortress of order against the chaos of the fringe, and he was now in that chaos. He took a step, then another, his bare feet sinking into mud. The sensation was disgusting and revelatory. He was not floating in a controlled environment. He was connected to something vast and dirty and real. A sob, a dry, rasping sound, tore from his throat. It was the first uncontrolled emotion he had ever voiced. He was terrified. He was exhilarated. He was Omega 734. No, he was Elian. He started to run, a clumsy, stumbling gait, away from the black wall and into the screaming, weeping night. He did not know where he was going. He only knew he was leaving. He was not an asset. He was not a number. He was a man running in the rain, and for the first time in his life, he was truly, horrifyingly alive. The cold was beginning to seep into him, a deep, dangerous chill. But he kept moving, driven by the ghost of a future he couldn't yet imagine, a future that tasted like rain and smelled like the wild, untamed earth. The city, or what passed for one in the fringe, was a jagged wound of neon and decay, a place where the collective's sterile order had long since rotted away, leaving behind a fever dream of desperate life. Elian moved through it like a phantom, a pale anomaly in the riot of color and grime. His gray uniform, now stained with mud and torn at the knee, marked him as an outsider, astray from a world they both feared and envied. He learned to stay in the shadows, to move in the moments between the flickering of a holographic advertisement and the hiss of a steam vent. He learned the currency of the fringe was not credits, but information, favors, and a certain kind of brutal stillness. His conditioning paradoxically became his shield. His ability to suppress his scent, to control his heart rate, to move with unnatural quietness, made him invisible. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life he did not understand. He ate what he could find. Discarded ration bars, sometimes a piece of fruit offered by a vendor who saw not an Omega, but a lost boy with haunted eyes. The hunger was a constant, gnawing presence, a stark contrast to the perfectly calibrated nutrition of the collective. Here to be hungry was to be alive. To be cold was to be alive. To be afraid was to be alive. His suppressed Omega nature began to stir, a sluggish beast waking from a long, drugged sleep. He felt a primal, desperate urge for safety, for warmth. He found himself drawn to soft things, a discarded piece of velvet, a pile of old newspapers. He would gather them in the abandoned transit terminal he had claimed as his shelter, arranging them into a crude nest. He did not understand the instinct. It was a malfunction, a piece of his base code asserting itself against years of programming. He would touch the soft materials, inhale their dusty, unfamiliar scents, and feel a pang of something he could not name. It was a hollow ache that felt suspiciously like longing. One night, huddled in his nest of refuse, a new scent cut through the city's miasma of cheap synth ale and fried protein. It was clean, cold, and sharp, like the air after a winter storm, with an undercurrent of something metallic and unyielding like freshly forged steel. It was a scent of absolute authority, an alpha, not a fringe alpha whose scents were typically raw, musky, and uncontrolled, a messy broadcast of aggression and need. This was different. It was refined, precise, and utterly dominant. It was the scent of the collective. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He flattened himself in his nest, pulling a grimy tarp over his body, trying to will himself into non-existence. He focused on his training, slowing his heart, clamping down on the spike of fear scent that threatened to betray him. Be nothing. Scent of nothing. Presence of nothing. The scent grew stronger, closer. It was a deliberate, searching presence, sweeping through the terminal like a targeted scanner. Elian could hear footsteps, measured and steady, crunching on the debris-strewn floor. They were the footsteps of a hunter, patient and certain. The steps paused a few feet from his hiding place. The air grew thick with the alpha's scent, a suffocating blanket of pure, controlled power. It was designed to intimidate, to force submission, and Elian's long-dormant Omega instincts screamed in terror and a perverse, horrifying flicker of recognition. This was the power his biology was coded to answer. The tarp was lifted away. Elian squeezed his eyes shut, a final, futile act of denial. "Designate Omega-734, a voice said. It was not loud, but it carried the same cold authority as the scent. It was calm, measured, and devoid of any discernible emotion. It was the voice of a man who was not asking a question, but stating a fact. Elian opened his eyes. The man standing over him was tall, his form outlined by the sickly green glow of a flickering exit sign. He wore the severe black uniform of a collective enforcer tailored to perfection, unmarred by the filth of the fringe. His face was composed of sharp angles and stark planes, his expression a mask of professional neutrality. His eyes, the color of polished chrome, were fixed on Elian, and in their depths there was no anger, no malice. There was only the cold, dispassionate focus of a tool on its objective. The alpha was Kalen, first enforcer of Sector Gamma. His name was a whisper of fear in the collective's lower echelons and a symbol of ruthless efficiency to its directors. He was the system's finest blade, honed to a razor's edge, his own alpha nature subjugated to the will of the collective. He did not feel pride or satisfaction in locating the runaway Omega. He felt only the quiet hum of a task nearing completion. The asset had been compromised, exposed to the chaotic variables of the fringe. It needed to be retrieved, recalibrated, and returned to its designated function. That was the mission. Simple, clean. Yet as he looked down at the Omega huddled in a nest of trash, something flickered in the cold, precise machinery of his mind. An unlogged variable. The asset was thinner, dirtier, but its eyes held a spark of defiance he had not seen in the files. The files showed a model of compliance, a perfect specimen of Omega conditioning. This creature, shivering but glaring up at him, was something else. "You will come with me, Vech," Kalen stated, his voice unchanging. It was an order, not a request. He extended a hand gloved in black leather. Elian flinched back, a hiss escaping his lips. It was a pathetic sound, a kitten trying to roar like a lion, but it was a sound of resistance. Kalen's expression did not change, but he noted the reaction. Resistance, moderate, physical condition, degraded, psychological state, unstable. He processed the data, calculating the most efficient method of retrieval. Force was an option, simple and effective, but the asset was delicate, a finely tuned instrument. Damage was to be avoided. He let his scent unfurl, just a fraction more, a controlled pulse of dominance meant to trigger a biological response of submission. It was a key designed to fit a lock. He watched as Elian's defiant posture wavered, his body trembling as instinct warred with will. The Omega's scent, long suppressed, bloomed for a second in the air, a faint, distressed fragrance of cold stone and ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. It was a scent of startling purity, and it struck a strange, dissonant chord within Kalen. It was not the cloying, sweet scent of most Omegas. It was clean, sharp, and lonely. It was interesting. The moment of hesitation was his only mistake. Elian, using the fractional shift in Kalen's focus, scrambled backward, crab-walking away over the debris. He was fast, his movements fueled by pure adrenaline. Kalen moved faster. He did not lunge or grab. He flowed, a shadow detaching itself from the darkness, his motion a study in lethal grace. He intercepted Elian's flight path, blocking him, his body a silent, immovable wall. Elian slammed into him, the impact a dull thud. Kalen did not so much as brace himself. He simply absorbed the force. He placed his hands on Elian's shoulders, his touch firm, impersonal. The Omega's body was a taut wire of tension, trembling violently. "Resistance is inefficient," Kalen said, his voice a low murmur close to Elian's ear. "It expends energy that you do not have. Cease." He could feel the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of Elian's heart through the thin uniform. He could smell the terror coming off him in waves, a sharp, acidic tang beneath the ozone. He was a finely calibrated machine processing a stream of unexpected, chaotic data. The mission was to retrieve an asset, but the thing trembling in his grasp did not feel like an asset. It felt like a terrified animal. And for the first time in his decorated career, Enforcer Kalen felt a flicker of something that was not in the mission parameters, a ghost of an emotion he could not name. He dismissed it. It was a malfunction. He was not malfunctioning. He was in control. He tightened his grip, the soft leather of his gloves a stark contrast to the unyielding strength beneath. "The choice was never yours to make," he said, and the words were not a cruelty, but a simple statement of fact, a law of their universe, a law he was there to enforce. The fight went out of Ilian in a single shuddering breath, a wave of utter despair that was so potent, Kalen felt a phantom echo of it in his own chest. The transport was a void, a space of polished black surfaces and a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the floor plates into Elian's bones. He sat on a hard bench, his wrists bound before him by a magnetic cuff that glowed with a soft, blue light. It was not tight, but its presence was absolute, a symbol of his failed freedom. Kalen sat opposite him, perfectly still, a statue carved from shadow and authority. He had not spoken a word since they left the terminal. He simply observed, his chrome eyes unblinking, analytical. Elian kept his own gaze fixed on the floor, on the reflection of the cuff's blue light shimmering on the dark metal. To look at the Alpha was to acknowledge his power, to submit. He would not. He would be a black hole, a void of his own, absorbing the Enforcer's presence without reaction. It was his last, pathetic bastion of defiance. The journey stretched into an unnerving silence, broken only by the vehicle's hum. The air was filtered, sterile, a ghost of the atmosphere in his unit. It was a deliberate choice, Elian knew. It was meant to soothe him, to return him to a state of familiar placidity, to remind him of where he belonged. It was a psychological tool, as much a restraint as the cuff on his wrists. But the sense of the fringe still clung to him. The damp earth, the city's grime, the ghost of rain. They were a shield against the encroaching sterility. He breathed them in, hoarding them like precious memories. He was not Omega 734. He was the boy who had tasted the rain. He was the creature who had built a nest of trash. He would not forget. Kalen watched the Omega. He cataloged the subtle tremors in the boy's hands, the rigid set of his spine, the way his gaze was fixed on the floor with an intensity that belied submission. This was not the broken, compliant asset he had expected. This was something else, something resilient. The Omega's scent, though faint, continued to prick at his senses. Ozone and cold stone. It was a scent that spoke of solitude and contained power, a storm waiting to break. It was a scent that did not belong on an Omega, who should smell of welcome and warmth, of spring flowers or sweet milk. This was the scent of a winter cliff face, stark and beautiful and dangerous. Kalen accessed the Omega's file on his internal data link, the text scrolling behind his eyes. Designate Omega 734, genetically engineered for optimal docility and receptivity. Conditioning protocols, 99.7% effective. Scent profile suppressed, neutral. The file was a lie, or at least it was incomplete. The conditioning had not been 99.7% effective. It had failed. It had created this creature of silent, vibrating defiance. He wondered about the 0.3% margin of error. What had the geneticists and psychologists in their sterile labs missed? What tiny, overlooked variable had blossomed into this beautiful, tragic rebellion? The thought was unprofessional. The asset state was a problem to be solved, not a poem to be analyzed. He was to deliver the asset to a reconditioning center. He would be praised for his efficiency. The asset would be wiped, its personality glitch erased, and it would be reassigned to a high-ranking alpha. It would fulfill its purpose. This was the logical, efficient, correct path. The system was designed for perfection. Deviations were corrected. The transport slowed, its hum descending in pitch. Elian risked a glance out of the reinforced window. They were not returning to the monolithic walls of the Sector Gamma Collective. They were in a dense forest, the trees ancient and massive, their branches heavy with snow. The transport moved down a private, unmarked road, the only sign of civilization in a sea of white and gray. A sprawling structure came into view, low-slung and modern, built of dark wood and black glass. It was a place of stark, minimalist beauty, half hidden in the snow-dusted pines. It looked nothing like a collective facility. It looked like a home. Panic, a more insidious and confusing strain than he had felt in the city, began to coil in Elian's stomach. This was not reconditioning. This was something else. Something unknown. And in the world of the collective, the unknown was always a threat. The transport slid to a silent stop in a subterranean garage. The door hissed open, revealing Kalen's impassive face. "We have arrived," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the concrete space. He deactivated the cuff with a touch from his data glove. The blue light died. Elian's hands were free, but he felt more trapped than ever. He rubbed his wrists, the skin smarting. Kalen watched the small human gesture, his expression unreadable. "This is a secure location," the Alpha stated as if sensing Elian's unspoken question. "A way station. You will remain here until further instructions are received." He led Elian from the garage into the house. The interior was as stark and beautiful as the exterior. Polished concrete floors, vast windows looking out onto the silent, snow-covered forest. The air was warm, clean, and smelled faintly of pine and cedar wood. It was a cage, but it was the most beautiful cage Elian had ever seen. There was no art on the walls, no personal effects. It was as sterile and impersonal as a high-security suite, yet it was undeniably Kalen's space. It smelled of him, that cold, clean scent of winter air and steel, now mingled with the organic scent of the wood. Kalen led him to a room at the end of a long hallway. It was simple, containing only a low bed with a gray blanket, a small table, and another large window that looked out into the woods. "This will be your room," Kalen said. "The door does not lock from the outside. The windows are reinforced. An attempt to escape would be unwise." Elian stood in the center of the room, his arms wrapped around himself. He felt small, exposed. He was a specimen in a jar, and the Alpha was his observer. "Why am I here?" The question was a whisper, a thread of sound in the oppressive silence. He had not meant to ask it. It was a sign of weakness, of a desire for information that he was not entitled to. Kalen regarded him for a long moment, his chrome eyes seeming to dissect him layer by layer. "You are an anomaly," he said finally. "Anomalies require analysis before they can be corrected. Rest. We will speak later." He turned and left, the door sliding shut with a soft hiss, leaving Elian alone with the silence and the snow and the terrifying unanswered question of his own existence. He was an anomaly, not an asset to be recovered, but a problem to be studied. He walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. The snow fell in thick, silent flakes, blanketing the world in a pristine, white perfection. It was beautiful. It was a prison. He saw his own faint reflection in the glass, a pale, haunted face against a backdrop of endless, silent white. He was lost. He was found. And he had no idea which was worse. The loneliness in this beautiful, empty house was a different beast from the loneliness of his unit, or the frantic solitude of the fringe. It was a deep, resonant emptiness that echoed the void within him, and it was a loneliness he now shared with the cold, silent Alpha, who was both his captor and his sole companion. The days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the vast windows. A pale gray dawn would creep over the snow-laden pines, followed by the flat, white light of midday, and then the long blue shadows of dusk that deepened into an impenetrable, starless night. Time had become a fluid, meaningless thing. Kalen provided him with food, simple, nutritious meals left on a tray outside his door, just as they had been in the collective. He was given new clothes, soft, dark fabrics that were a world away from his rough uniform but carried the same impersonal, functional aesthetic. He was a prisoner, but a well-cared-for one, a pet, a specimen. He spent most of his time in his room, sitting by the window, watching the snow. The silence of the forest was a living thing, a heavy blanket that muffled the world. It was a different silence from the manufactured quiet of the collective. This silence was filled with the faint whisper of wind in the trees, the occasional soft thud of snow falling from a branch. It was a silence that invited introspection, and Elian had nothing but his own fractured self to inspect. His instincts, so violently awakened in the fringe, were now a constant low thrum beneath the surface of his conditioning. The urge to nest was a physical ache. He would find himself staring at the soft gray blanket on his bed, his hands itching with the need to shape it, to create a space of safety and warmth. He resisted. It was a weakness. It was the Omega in him, the part the collective had tried to excise, asserting itself. To give in would be to surrender to the very biology he had fled. He would not. He would remain a creature of pure, defiant will. He saw Kalen only intermittently. The Alpha would appear, a silent shadow in the hallway, his presence announced only by the subtle shift in the air, the faint, clean scent of winter steel. He would observe Elian from a distance, his chrome eyes analytical, his face an unreadable mask. They rarely spoke. The few exchanges they had were brief, sterile. Did you eat? Yes. Do you require anything? No. The words were meaningless, a ritual of control and submission. The real conversation was happening on a different frequency. In the charged silence between them, in the way Kalen's scent would intensify slightly when Elian met his gaze, in the way Elian's heart would hammer against his ribs in a frantic, terrified rhythm. One evening, Elian succumbed. The ache was too much, the loneliness too vast. He pulled the blanket from the bed, his movements furtive, as if committing a crime. He curled up in the corner of the room by the cold glass of the window and began to shape the fabric. He tucked it around himself, creating a small enclosed space, a pathetic imitation of a den. He pulled his knees to his chest, burying his face in the soft material. It smelled faintly of the house's clean cedar scent, and underneath that, the ghost of Kalen's own sterile fragrance. The act of nesting, of surrendering to this primal instinct, did not bring the comfort he craved. It brought only a wave of profound, soul-crushing shame. He had failed. He was nothing but a collection of biological imperatives, a slave to his designation. A dry, silent sob shook his frame. He was weeping without tears. A deep internal grief for the self he was losing, or perhaps the self he had never been allowed to have. The door to his room hissed open. Elian froze, his body rigid with humiliation. Kalen stood in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette against the lighted hall. He did not move for a long time, simply stood there, his gaze fixed on Elian huddled in his makeshift nest. Elian expected derision, a cold, clinical comment on his behavior, Omega instinct manifestation, notable, subject reverting to base programming. But Kalen said nothing. He walked into the room, his footsteps silent on the concrete floor. He stopped a few feet away, his presence a towering weight in the small space. Elian braced himself for a reprimand, for the inevitable assertion of control. Instead, Kalen did something entirely unexpected. He went to the closet, pulled out a second, thicker blanket, and walked back to where Elian was curled. He held it for a moment, then gently, almost hesitantly, draped it over Elian's trembling shoulders. The blanket was heavy, warm, and it smelled more strongly of the Alpha, of that clean, cold scent of winter air and steel. It was not a comforting scent, but it was a scent of presence, of substance. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos of Elian's emotions. Elian looked up at him, his storm-gray eyes wide with confusion. Kalen's face was, as always, a mask of neutrality. But in the dim light, Elian thought he saw something flicker in the depths of his chrome eyes. A crack in the perfect, polished surface. "The temperature is dropping," Kalen said, his voice a low, quiet rumble. "It is inefficient to be cold." He then turned and left as silently as he had come, the door hissing shut behind him. Elian was left alone, Wrapped in the Alpha's scent, his mind reeling, it was not an act of kindness. Kindness was an inefficient, sentimental emotion that had no place in the collective's lexicon. It was something else. A logical action to preserve an asset's body temperature, a calculated gesture to foster compliance. But it had felt different. It had felt like a moment of connection, a silent acknowledgement of his distress. He pulled the heavy blanket tighter around himself, inhaling the cold, clean scent. It was the scent of his captor, his observer, and for a terrifying, bewildering moment it felt like the scent of safety. He was not just an anomaly to be studied, he was something more. And that, he realized, was a far more dangerous proposition. Kalen retreated to his study, the heart of the house, a room walled with screens that were currently dark. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the same silent, snow-covered forest that Elian watched. The image of the Omega curled in that pathetic nest, his body shaking with silent sobs, was burned into his mind. It was a data point that his processors could not reconcile. He had seen the nesting instinct before in controlled breeding environments. It was a biological function, a series of predictable behaviors. But this had been an act of profound desperation, of a grief so deep it had a physical weight, and his own reaction had been illogical, unprofessional. Giving the Omega the blanket was an impulse, an action that bypassed his rigid protocols. He had rationalized it as a measure to maintain the asset's physical well-being, but that was a lie. He had done it because the sight of Elian's suffering had caused a painful, tightening sensation in his own chest, an empathic resonance. He was a finely tuned instrument, and the Omega was a song of such pure, painful melancholy that he had begun to vibrate with it. He was not supposed to feel. Feelings were glitches, messy variables that compromised efficiency. His entire life, his entire being, was a testament to the subjugation of feeling to logic, of instinct to will. He was the collective's perfect alpha, his dominance a tool, not a passion. His desires were sublimated into duty. Yet this Omega was unraveling him. The boy's scent of ozone and stone was a constant, subtle presence in the house. A scent that spoke of a wildness and a loneliness that echoed something deep within himself. He had always been alone, even when surrounded by the teeming millions of the collective. He was a singular entity, a blade designed for a single purpose. He had never felt the lack of connection as a loss. It was simply a state of being, until now. Now the silence in the house felt different. It was not the silence of solitude. It was the silence of a shared, unspoken tension. He activated one of the screens. A secure channel opened, the face of Director Valerius appearing in crisp, cold holography. Valerius was a man who looked as if he had been sculpted from ice. His features sharp, his eyes a pale, unforgiving blue. He was one of the architects of the collective, a true believer in the perfection of their system. "Enforcer," Valerius said, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. "Report." "The asset has been secured, ah." Kalen replied, his own voice the familiar detached instrument of his office. "It is contained at Way Station Sierra." "Its condition?" "Physically stable, psychologically volatile. The fringe has had a notable degenerative effect on its conditioning." Valerius's lips thinned into a line of displeasure. "Unsurprising. The chaos of the unregulated zones is a contagion. Why have you not transferred it to the reconditioning center at Epsilon?" This was the critical moment, the point of deviation. Kalen had prepared his answer, a careful construction of logic and protocol. The asset presents as a unique case of conditioning failure. Its psychological resilience is anomalous. A standard wipe might not be sufficient. It could result in total system collapse, rendering the asset useless. I believe a period of observation and an analysis is required to determine the most effective recalibration protocol. He was using the system's own language against it. He was framing his insubordination as a higher form of duty. Valerius was silent for a moment, his pale eyes seeming to pierce through the screen to dissect Kalen's motives. Kalen kept his expression neutral, his heart rate steady. He was a black box, betraying nothing. "Your logic is sound, Enforcer," Valerius said finally, a hint of something cold and sharp in his tone. "You have 7 cycles. Analyze your anomaly, determine its weakness, then deliver it to Epsilon for processing. The collective has a significant investment in this particular asset. Do not disappoint me." The channel closed, leaving Kalen alone in the dark room, the director's final words hanging in the air, "Determine its weakness." Kalen looked out the window again, towards the part of the house where Elian slept, wrapped in his blanket. He was the Omega's weakness, his presence, his dominance, his authority. But as he stood there, feeling the phantom echo of Elian's despair in his own chest, he was forced to consider a terrifying, heretical thought. Perhaps the Omega was his. The blanket was a catalyst. It was a bridge across the silent chasm that separated them. The next morning, when Elian emerged from his room, he found Kalen in the main living area standing by the window. The Alpha turned as he approached, his chrome eyes meeting Elian's. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Elian clutched the heavy blanket, which he had folded neatly in his hands. He held it out to Kalen. An offering, a return to the status quo. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling foreign and stiff on his tongue. Kalen looked at the blanket, then back at Elian's face. He did not take it. "Keep it," he said. "It is a simple utility. Its function is to provide warmth. You are the one who requires it." The refusal was another unexpected move, another disruption of the power dynamic. Elian stood there, holding the blanket, unsure of what to do. He was adrift, the familiar rules of interaction dissolving around him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why aren't I at a reconditioning center?" Kalen was silent for a long moment, his gaze intense. "I told you. You are an anomaly," he said. "Your file says you should be broken. You are not. I need to understand why." "So you can fix me," Elian stated, the words laced with a bitterness that surprised him. "So you can find the crack in my programming and seal it shut." "Yes," Kalen said without hesitation. The cold, honest brutality of the word was like a slap. Of course, this was not compassion. This was research. He was a puzzle to be solved, a machine to be repaired. The flicker of hope he had allowed himself to feel died, turning to ash in his chest. He turned to walk away, to retreat back into the safety of his silence. "What did you see?" Kalen's voice stopped him. "Out there, in the fringe. What did you experience that strengthened your deviation?" Elian did not turn around. He stared at the polished concrete floor. What had he seen? Chaos, filth, desperation, kindness. He had seen a child share a piece of bread with a stray dog. He had seen 2 lovers kissing in a rain-slicked alley. He had seen an old woman tending to a single, pathetic flower growing in a crack in the pavement. He had seen life, messy and imperfect and beautiful. How could he explain that to a man who was the living embodiment of sterile perfection? "I saw people," he said softly. "Not assets, not designations, just people, living." He finally turned to face the Alpha, a spark of his old defiance rekindled in his eyes. "You wouldn't understand. In your world, there are no people. There are only functions." For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed Kalen's face. It was not anger. It was something more complex, something that looked almost like pain. "You are wrong," Kalen said, his voice low and tight. "There is a function for everything, even for this." He gestured vaguely, at the house, at the silence, at the space between them. And I will discover it. The conversation was over, but something had irrevocably shifted. The observer and the observed had engaged. The puzzle had begun to speak back to its solver. And in the cold, sterile environment of the way station, a dangerous organic thing had begun to take root. A relationship. And in the world of the collective, that was the most dangerous anomaly of all. A strange, unspoken routine began to form. Kalen no longer left Elian's food outside his door. He would bring the tray into the main living area, and they would eat in silence, sitting at opposite ends of a long, dark wood table. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with 1,000 tiny observations. Elian watched the precise, economical way Kalen ate, the way he held his fork, the way his gaze would occasionally drift to the snow-covered trees outside. Kalen, in turn, observed the way Elian would hesitate before his first bite, as if still unaccustomed to the regularity of meals. He noted the way the Omega's eyes, the color of a turbulent sea, would follow a bird flying past the window, a flicker of longing in their depths. The analysis continued, but its nature had changed. It was no longer a clinical study of an asset. It was a cautious, mutual exploration. Kalen began to ask questions, his voice always maintaining its detached, clinical tone, but the subjects were deeply personal. "Tell me about your incubation," he said one evening, as the blue twilight bled through the windows. Elian, who had been conditioned to answer any query from a superior, found himself speaking of the sensory deprivation of the creche, the endless loop of educational audio, the complete absence of physical contact. He spoke of it in the flat, dispassionate tone he had been taught, but the memories were sharp-edged fragments of a lonely, sterile childhood. He was a product, grown in a lab, decanted into a life of servitude. Kalen listened without interruption, his face impassive, but Elian could feel the Alpha's attention, a focused, intense energy directed entirely at him. When he finished, there was a long silence. There was no maternal contact, Kalen stated. It was not a question. It is deemed an inefficient variable. It fosters attachments that compromise function. Elian recited, the words ingrained in him like scripture. "Yes," Kalen said, his voice quiet. "Function." A bond was forming between them, a strange, empathic link that transcended words. Elian began to feel the Alpha's presence even when he wasn't in the room, a low thrum of awareness at the edge of his senses. Sometimes, when a wave of despair washed over him, he would feel a subtle answering echo, a faint, cold spike of something from Kalen's end of the house. It wasn't sympathy. It was a shared resonance, as if two tuning forks, carved from the same lonely stone, had been struck at once. One night, Elian was woken by a nightmare. He was back in the collective, strapped to a table in a white room, the calm, smiling face of a technician leaning over him with a needle. He could feel the cold liquid of the hormonal suppressants entering his veins, the slow, chemical death of his own nature. He woke up with a gasp, his body drenched in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. The scent of his fear, sharp and acrid, filled the small room. A moment later, his door hissed open. Kalen stood there, already dressed in his dark uniform, his chrome eyes scanning the room. He must have been alerted by the biometric sensors in the house, the ones that monitored Elian's vital signs. "Report," Kalen said, his voice crisp and professional, cutting through the lingering fog of the dream. "A nightmare," Elian managed to say, his voice hoarse. He was curled into a ball, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. He felt exposed, pathetic. Kalen walked into the room, stopping beside the bed. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his presence a solid, grounding weight in the terrifying darkness. The silence stretched, and slowly, Elian's heart rate began to slow, his ragged breathing evening out. The Alpha's calm was a palpable force, a quiet anchor in the storm of Elian's terror. After a few minutes, Kalen reached down and adjusted the blanket, pulling it more securely over Elian's shoulders. His fingers brushed against Elian's neck, a brief, shocking point of contact. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through Elian's entire system. It was the first time they had touched since the capture, the first touch that was not about restraint or control. It was gentle. Kalen withdrew his hand as if burned. He stood there for another moment, his expression unreadable in the shadows, then turned and left without a word. Elian lay in the darkness, the ghost of that touch tingling on his skin. He was Kalen's prisoner, his experiment, and yet the Alpha had come to him in the night, had stood vigil over his fear, had offered a moment of fleeting, impossible tenderness. The lines were blurring. The roles of captor and captive, of observer and observed, were becoming hopelessly, dangerously entangled. Kalen stood in the darkness of the hallway, his back pressed against the cold wall. He could still feel the warmth of the Omega skin on his fingertips, a jolt, a spark of connection that had short-circuited his carefully maintained control. He had felt the boy's terror as if it were his own, a suffocating, helpless panic that had clawed at his throat. The empathic link between them was growing stronger, more undeniable. It was a phenomenon he had only read about in classified files, a rare, powerful bond that could form between alphas and omegas of high genetic compatibility. The collective had tried to engineer it for breeding purposes, but had failed. It was an organic, chaotic variable they could not control, and it was happening to him. To him, the system's most controlled, most logical enforcer. He was becoming compromised. He was failing his mission. His purpose was to analyze the Omega's weakness, but instead he was finding his own. His weakness was the tremor in Elian's hands, the defiant spark in his storm-gray eyes, the lonely, beautiful scent of ozone and cold stone. His weakness was the overwhelming, illogical urge to protect the very anomaly he was supposed to destroy. He returned to his study and activated the secure channel. Director Valerius's icy face materialized again. "Enforcer, you have 3 cycles remaining. Your report is due." "My analysis is ongoing," Kalen said, his voice a flawless replica of its usual calm. "The subject's deviation is rooted in a deep-seated psychological trauma related to its conditioning. A standard wipe will be ineffective." "Then propose an alternative, Sta," Valerius said, his voice edged with impatience. Kalen took a breath. This was the precipice. "A modified protocol is required, he began, weaving a new lie from the threads of the old one. A period of controlled integration with a compatible alpha to reestablish the correct biological imperatives and overwrite the flawed psychological pathways. It would require a more nuanced approach than the reconditioning center can provide." Valerius's eyes narrowed. "A compatible alpha? You are referring to yourself, I presume?" "My genetic profile has a 97.3% compatibility rating with the asset," Kalen stated, the number a cold, hard fact he had pulled from the archives. "I am the logical choice to administer the protocol." It was a gamble of extraordinary proportions. He was proposing to take possession of the asset, to bind it to himself under the guise of reconditioning. He was using the system's obsession with logic and efficiency to hide a motive that was anything but. Valerius was silent for a full minute, his pale blue eyes boring into Kalen. Kalen met his gaze without flinching, his mind a fortress of cold, calculated calm. He was the perfect enforcer. He was beyond reproach. Who would ever suspect him of sentiment? "A bold proposal, enforcer," Valerius said slowly, a strange, thin smile touching his lips. It was not a pleasant expression. "Very well. You may proceed with your protocol. But be aware, the collective is not interested in your personal experiments. We are interested in results. If the asset is not fully compliant and ready for reassignment by the end of the next cycle, I will come to your way station myself, and I will correct not one, but two anomalies. The channel went dark. The threat was clear, unspoken, but absolute. Kalen had bought himself more time, but he had also placed a target on both their backs. He was no longer just observing. He had intervened. He had chosen a side. He had chosen the Omega. And in doing so, he had declared a quiet, secret war against the very system he had sworn his life to uphold. The silence of the house was no longer a comfort. It was the ticking of a clock. The dynamic shifted again, subtly but seismically. There was a new tension in the house, a sense of borrowed time. Kalen's presence became more constant. He no longer kept his distance. He would sit in the same room as Elian for hours, sometimes reading from a data pad, sometimes simply watching the snow. He was no longer just an observer. He was a guardian, a silent, watchful predator circling the thing he had claimed. Elian felt the change acutely. The alpha scent seemed to permeate the entire house now, a constant reminder of his power and his proximity. It was no longer just intimidating, it was possessive, a claim being laid molecule by molecule. Elian found himself in a state of profound confusion. He was still a prisoner, but the nature of his captivity had changed. He felt a strange, terrifying sense of safety in Kalen's presence. The Alpha was a shield against the world, against the collective that wanted to erase him. But the shield was also a cage, its bars forged from Kalen's silent, unyielding will. He began to test the boundaries of this new arrangement. One afternoon, as Kalen worked on a data pad, Elian walked over and stood before him. "I want to go outside," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Kalen looked up, his chrome eyes unreadable. The forest was a wilderness, a place of potential escape, a logical request to deny. "The temperature is below freezing. You are not equipped," Kalen stated. "You have a coat in the closet," Elian countered, remembering a heavy black coat he had seen. "I saw it." Kalen was silent for a moment. Elian could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes, the weighing of risk versus... what? Appeasement? Trust? "For 10 minutes, Kalen said finally, "and I will be with you." It was a victory, a small but significant concession. Kalen retrieved the coat. It was large and heavy, made of a thick, insulated material. As he helped Elian into it, the coat enveloped him, warm and smelling intensely of the Alpha. It felt like an embrace. The feeling was so foreign, so overwhelming, that Elian stood frozen for a moment, lost in the sensation. Kalen's hands rested on his shoulders, his touch firm, impersonal, and yet it sent a tremor through Elian's entire body. They stepped outside, into the brilliant, cold air. The world was a symphony of white and gray, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots in the snow. Elian took a deep breath, the frigid air burning his lungs. It was the first time he had been outside since Kalen had brought him here. It was the taste of a freedom that was not quite freedom. He walked to the edge of the woods, reaching out a bare hand to touch the rough, cold bark of a pine tree. He ran his fingers over the needles, marveling at their sharp, real texture. Kalen stood a few feet behind him, a silent, watchful guardian. He was giving Elian a semblance of freedom, but the invisible leash was still there, held tight in the Alpha's hand. Elian turned to face him, the snow swirling around them. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked. "It is a risk. I could run." Kalen's expression did not change. "You would not get far," he said, a simple statement of fact. "And it is part of the protocol, exposing you to controlled sensory stimuli to reacclimate your system. Always the protocol, always the clinical justification for an act that felt intensely personal." Elian felt a surge of frustration. He wanted to break through that perfect, controlled facade. He wanted to see the man behind the enforcer. Is that all I am to you? He demanded, his voice rising, a plume of white mist in the cold air. A system to be reacclimated? An experiment? He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing directly in front of the Alpha, forced to tilt his head back to meet Kalen's gaze. Is there anything inside you that isn't part of a protocol? The question hung between them, sharp and dangerous. Kalen's jaw tightened, the only sign of the turmoil within. The bond between them flared, and for a split second, Elian felt it. A dizzying, overwhelming wave of the Alpha's emotion. It was not the cold control he projected, it was a maelstrom of conflict, of possessiveness so fierce it was painful, of a loneliness that mirrored his own, and underneath it all a terrifying, unfamiliar tenderness. The raw, unfiltered truth of it stole his breath. Kalen's control snapped back into place a moment later, his face once again an impassive mask. But the mask had slipped. Elian had seen what was behind it. Your 10 minutes are over, Kalen said, his voice tight, strained. We are going back inside. He turned and walked back toward the house, his stride stiff. Elian stood for a moment in the falling snow, his heart hammering. He was not just an experiment. He was the catalyst that was breaking the unbreakable enforcer. And as he followed Kalen back into the warmth of their shared prison, he realized that the power dynamic had shifted once more. He did not know what Kalen was feeling, not in words, but he had felt the shape of it. And that knowledge was a weapon. It was a key. It was, perhaps, a hope. The revelation in the snow changed everything. The silence in the house was no longer passive. It was electric. Every shared glance, every accidental brush of hands as they passed in the hallway was charged with the memory of that raw, unfiltered emotion. Elian felt emboldened, less a captive and more an equal player in a dangerous, unspoken game. Kalen, in turn, seemed to retreat further into himself, his control more rigid than ever, as if to compensate for the crack Elian had exposed. He avoided being alone with Elian, busying himself in his study for long hours. But the bond between them was a current that could not be shut off. They felt each other's presence, each other's moods, a constant subliminal conversation happening beneath the surface of their quiet lives. Elian knew when Kalen was agitated, the feeling a low, static hum at the edge of his awareness. Kalen, he suspected, could feel the waves of melancholy that still washed over Elian, the moments of quiet despair. He was trying to build the walls back up, but Elian now knew there was something on the other side. One night, the house's alert system chimed, a soft, unobtrusive sound that nonetheless cut through the silence like a scream. Elian, who was in the living area, saw Kalen emerge from his study, his face grim. "What is it?" Elian asked. "A perimeter alert," Kalen said, his eyes fixed on a screen that had materialized on the wall, showing a schematic of the property. "Likely an animal. The sensors are sensitive." But there was a tension in Kalen's posture that betrayed his casual words. This was not an animal. They both knew it. This was the system. This was Valerius. The clock had run out. Kalen moved to the main window, peering out into the impenetrable darkness. "Go to your room," he ordered, his voice sharp, the enforcer back in full command. "Stay there. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." "No," Elian said, the word coming out with a surprising firmness. He walked to Kalen's side, standing with him before the vast expanse of glass. "I'm not hiding. Whatever is coming, it's coming for both of us." Kalen looked at him, his chrome eyes wide with a flicker of surprise and then something else. "Respect." He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. "Stay behind me." A moment later, the transport appeared, a black, silent specter gliding out of the forest, its headlights cutting twin beams through the darkness. It was a collective enforcer vehicle, identical to the one that had brought Elian here. The doors hissed open and two figures emerged, dressed in the same severe black uniforms as Kalen. But a third figure followed them, a man in a long gray coat, his pale hair almost white in the transport's lights. Director Valerius. He had come himself. "He knows you lied," Elian whispered, a cold dread seeping into his bones. "He was never going to give you more time." "I know," Kalen said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned away from the window. "There is a service tunnel in the garage. It leads half a kilometer into the woods. Go, now." "I'm not leaving you," Elian said, his voice fierce. He could feel the Alpha's protective fury, a roaring fire he was trying to contain behind a wall of ice. But he could also feel his fear, not for himself, but for Elian. "Your survival is the primary objective," Kalen said, his voice reverting to the cold, hard language of a mission briefing. "My function is to ensure that objective is met. Your presence here is a tactical liability. Go." He grabbed Elian's arm, his grip like steel, and began pulling him toward the garage. The house's main door chimed, a polite, civilized sound that heralded the coming violence. Valerius was at the door. "There's no time," Elian hissed, pulling back. "We have to fight them." "We cannot win," Kalen stated, the words a cold, hard truth. "They have superior numbers, and I am compromised." He looked at Elian, and in that moment, the mask was gone completely. In his eyes was a raw, desperate plea. Live. That was all that mattered to him, that Elian lived. And in that moment, Elian understood. This was never about reconditioning. This was never about a protocol. From the moment Kalen had found him in that ruined terminal, this had been about something else entirely. Something Kalen himself probably didn't understand until this very moment. He had not captured an asset, he had found his pack. The door slid open. Director Valerius stood there flanked by the two enforcers. He smiled his thin, bloodless smile. "Kalen," he said, his voice smooth as polished ice, "your protocol appears to be behind schedule. I have come to assist in its completion." His pale eyes slid past Kalen to fix on Elian. The director's gaze was like a physical violation, cold and clinical, stripping him bare, seeing him as nothing more than a failed experiment, a line of corrupted code to be deleted. "And look," Valerius continued, his smile widening slightly, "the anomaly itself. It seems more defiant than when it left. Your methods, Enforcer, are clearly lacking." "Director Bakaba," Kalen said, his voice dangerously calm. He had positioned himself slightly in front of Elian, a subtle, protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by Valerius. "Your presence here is unnecessary." "I disagree," Valerius replied, stepping into the house, his enforcers following like twin shadows. "I believe it is essential. You have developed an attachment, a sentimental, inefficient, and frankly disgusting flaw. You were my finest instrument, Kalen. And you have allowed yourself to rust." He gestured to his enforcers. "Take the Omega. Bring it to the transport. It is scheduled for immediate termination and dissection. Its genetic material may prove useful in preventing future failures." The words were a death sentence, delivered with the casual air of a corporate directive. The two enforcers moved forward. Kalen did not. He remained perfectly still, a statue of black-clad fury. "You will not touch him," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl that was pure, undiluted alpha. The air in the room crackled with tension. The clean, cold scent of Kalen's dominance flooded the space, a palpable wave of power. The two enforcers hesitated, their own lesser alpha instincts flinching in the face of such absolute authority. Valerius laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Instinct! How predictable! How disappointing! You have truly reverted. You are no better than the animals in the fringe." He pulled a small silver device from his coat pocket. "Your authority is conditional, Kalen, and I am revoking it." He pressed a button. A high-frequency sound, barely audible to Elian, filled the air. Kalen cried out, a raw, agonized sound, and staggered back, clutching his head. Pain, sharp and blinding, lanced through Elian's own skull as the empathic bond transmitted the Alpha's agony directly to him. "A neural override, chum," Valerius explained calmly as Kalen fell to one knee, his body trembling. "A failsafe I had installed in all my top enforcers. It disrupts the higher neurological functions, leaving only the base motor skills. It is quite painful, I believe." The enforcers, no longer held back by Kalen's authority, moved toward Elian. He was paralyzed, caught between the side of Kalen's suffering and the approaching threat. His conditioning screamed at him to submit, to comply, to accept his fate. But the memory of the rain, the touch of Kalen's hand, the sight of the defiance in his own reflection, they screamed louder. He was not an asset. He would not be dissected. He backed away, his eyes darting around for a weapon, for an escape. He saw a heavy sculptural object on a nearby table, a piece of polished obsidian. As the first enforcer reached for him, Elian snatched it up and swung it with all his might. The blow connected with the side of the enforcer's head with a sickening crack. The man crumpled to the floor without a sound. The second enforcer stared in shock for a fraction of a second, a fatal hesitation. From the floor, Kalen lunged. He was moving on pure instinct, his face a mask of primal fury, the director's override unable to quell the deepest, most fundamental imperative of an alpha protecting his mate. He slammed into the second enforcer, and they went down in a tangle of limbs. Valerius watched the chaos with a look of detached distaste. "Sloppy," he murmured, raising his device again, preparing to increase the frequency, to incapacitate Kalen completely. But as he did, he failed to notice Elian, who was now moving not with the desperation of a victim, but with the cold precision of a creature who had learned from the best. Elian scooped up the fallen enforcer's sidearm, a sleek black energy pistol. He had never held a weapon before, but his mind, trained for data retention, recalled every schematic he had ever seen. His hands were steady. He raised the pistol and aimed it directly at Director Valerius. "Stop," Elian said, his voice clear and cold, echoing Kalen's own authority. Valerius froze, his pale eyes widening in genuine surprise. He looked from the defiant Omega to the pistol, and for the first time, his smile vanished. The hunter had become the hunted. The experiment was holding the gun, and in that frozen moment of reversal, the entire foundation of their world cracked. The standoff held for a breath, a silent tableau of shifting power. Kalen, having subdued the second enforcer with brutal efficiency, rose to his feet, his body still tense with the residual effects of the neural override. He looked at Elian, at the weapon held steady in his hands, at the cold, determined set of his jaw. He saw not a frightened Omega, but a partner, a warrior. Pride, a fierce, burning emotion he had never truly felt before, surged through him. Valerius, recovering from his shock, composed his features into a mask of contemptuous calm. "You will not shoot me, anomaly," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It is not in your programming. You are designed for compliance, for reception, not for violence." "My programming is full of errors, Elian replied, his voice unwavering. "You made me this way. You and your sterile labs and your perfect system. You wanted a vessel, but you created a weapon instead." He took a step forward, the gun never wavering. "Now drop the device, slowly." Valerius hesitated, his mind clearly racing, calculating the odds. He looked at Kalen, who was now standing at Elian's side, a silent, lethal promise of violence. He looked at the two unconscious enforcers on the floor. His plan, so neat and logical, had devolved into this chaotic, unpredictable mess. With a sneer of disgust, he tossed the silver neural override device onto the floor. Kalen immediately crushed it under his boot. The faint, high-frequency hum ceased. The pressure in both their minds vanished. "It changes nothing," Valerius said, his voice tight with fury. "You cannot escape. The collective is everywhere. You will be hunted. You will be found. This little act of defiance is nothing but a prelude to your erasure. Perhaps, Kalen said, his voice low and steady. He picked up the second enforcer's pistol, the weight of it familiar and comfortable in his hand. But not today. The next few minutes were a blur of controlled, efficient action. They bound Valerius and his remaining conscious enforcer with the magnetic cuffs from their own belts. They were no longer the enforcers of the system. They were its prisoners. Kalen moved with a renewed sense of purpose, not as a tool of the collective, but as a free agent. He accessed the house's security system, wiping the logs, triggering a localized EMP that would fry the external sensors and the transport's communication systems. He was dismantling his own cage piece by piece. "We have to go," Kalen said, turning to Elian. "They will send more. We have maybe a 2-hour head start." "Where will we go?" Elian asked, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving a trembling exhaustion in its wake. The reality of what they had done was beginning to sink in. They were fugitives, traitors. They had declared war on the most powerful entity in their known world. Kalen looked at him, and for the first time, a genuine, unguarded emotion showed on his face. It was not a smile, but a softening of his severe features, a warmth in his chrome eyes. "Somewhere they won't find us," he said. "The fringe is large. There are worlds beyond the collective's reach. We will find one." He reached out, not to grab or restrain, but to gently take the pistol from Elian's hand. His fingers brushed against Elian's, and this time, neither of them pulled away. The touch was an anchor, a promise. "You were magnificent," Kalen said, his voice a low murmur meant only for Elian. The praise, coming from him, was more potent than any declaration of love. It was an acknowledgement of Elian's strength, of his will. It was the validation he had craved his entire life. They left the house, a monument to a life Kalen was leaving behind, and disappeared into the snow-covered forest, using the service tunnel he had mentioned. They emerged into the silent, white wilderness, the only sounds the crunch of their boots and the whisper of the wind. They were two fugitives, a disgraced enforcer and a rogue Omega, with nothing but each other and a desperate, fragile hope. As they walked, Elian looked back at the sky above the trees. There was no sign of the house, no light, no smoke. It was as if it had never existed. He felt a pang of something that was almost sadness for the beautiful cage they had shared. It was where he had started to become himself. It was where Kalen had started to become free. After an hour of walking, they reached a hidden cache Kalen had prepared, a small camouflage bunker containing supplies, unmarked clothing, and a small, all-terrain vehicle. It was a contingency plan, a secret Kalen had kept even from the collective, a seed of his own rebellion, planted long ago. As they prepared to leave, Kalen paused and turned to Elian. The first rays of dawn were beginning to filter through the trees, painting the snow in shades of pale rose and gray. "Elian," he said, speaking his name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep, resonant voice was a physical thing, a claiming. Elian looked up at him, his heart aching with a mix of fear and a wild, soaring hope. Kalen reached out and gently brushed a stray flake of snow from Elian's cheek. The gesture was tender, intimate, a stark contrast to the cold, hard man he had once been. "I am not a good man," Kalen said, his voice raw with an emotion Elian could not name. "I have served a cruel system. I have done things. But I will spend the rest of my life protecting you. That is my new function. That is my new protocol." Elian's eyes filled with tears, the first real tears he had ever shed. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. He had run from the collective seeking freedom, and had found it in the most unlikely of places, in the custody of the man sent to capture him. "We'll protect each other," Elian said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached up, his hand trembling slightly, and laid it against the side of Kalen's face. The skin was cold from the winter air, but underneath he could feel the warmth, the life. The Alpha leaned into his touch, his eyes closing for a brief moment, a silent surrender. When he opened them again, the last traces of the Enforcer were gone. In his chrome eyes, Elian saw only the man, his Alpha, his Kalen. They got into the vehicle, leaving the forest and the snow and the ghosts of their past lives behind. They drove towards the rising sun, towards an unknown future in the lawless expanse of the Fringe. They were not an Enforcer and his asset. They were not an Alpha and his Omega in the way the collective defined it. They were something new, a pack of two, a rebellion of two. And as the vehicle sped away, Elian leaned his head against Kalen's shoulder, inhaling his scent, not of winter air and cold steel anymore, but of pine and snow and the promise of a hard-won shared freedom. He was not a number. He was not an anomaly. He was Elian. And for the first time, he was home.